Today, we heard about the many thoughtful and compassionate actions of friends here in Australia. Tonight, I invite you to join me in reflecting on the work of the Spirit that grounds our work and upholds us over the years. Sink down to the seed, as Isaac Pennington would say. Join me sailing this vast ocean of light and love that upholds us and that sustains our work to bring about the kingdom of God, the new creation here on earth. I've had the gift of friends who own sailboats and invited me to join them. So I invite you to join me in exploring the ways in which being on the open sea offers words and images of how the Spirit grounds our actions in the world and calls us to be everyday prophets. Several friends have walked alongside me as I wrote this Backhouse lecture. One of them is Glynis, who is more informally and happily known as Glee. Her story is just one example of what I mean by everyday prophets. This spring, in my home state of Oregon, a group of armed men occupied a wildlife refuge in the name of freedom from government. As a result, the children at the school where Glee's son attended began to explore which classmates were willing to play with guns and weaponry. When her son mentioned he had a peace mom and that he's a Quaker, the gloves were off. Boys on the playground taunted him, and he'd not return their pretend nuclear bombing attacks. And he was harassed by them for being what we in the US call a special needs child. He was in tears most evenings. In response to the harassment, this young boy pasted sticky notes all over the room saying, "War is not the answer." His teachers assumed that his disability caused all these problems. After a time of discernment, Glee wrote those teachers asking that they not exclude him because of his disability. While this is part of a much longer story, in short, Glee's letter pointing to compassion and the well-being of the whole community brought strong positive response from the school staff. It initiated ongoing work addressing the many small aggressions in the classroom. While there continued to be some incidents where the children and parents tested Glee's response as a peace mom, rather than demanding a direct response, Glee brought her anger and frustration into worship. Waiting on the Spirit keeps sustaining her work, keeps her returning to the classroom to volunteer. Such are the actions of what I've come to call everyday prophets. Where I see getting used to this. Yes. Where I see lively meetings, I see groups of individuals who, in the words of Diane Randall, are listening deeply and constantly to God, waiting for guidance, acting with courage and confidence, practicing humility, obedience, and patience. So I suggest that we all think of ourselves as a band of everyday prophets whose job description I just read. Listening deeply for the Spirit in our lives, every day, perhaps every hour. Waiting for guidance, even in the ordinary rhythm of life. Acting with courage and confidence, practicing humility, obedience, and patience. I use the word prophet here not in relation to foretelling the future, but to refer to anyone who listens for divine guidance and lives in accord with what the light shows, and seeks to make that inward teacher available to others. To say this another way, discernment is central to what we do. So can we each ask ourselves, do I know how to sort out my own motivations? Do I recognize the various sources of voices in my head? Once I hear what the voice of the light might be telling me, am I willing to act? Do I have that courage to step forward? Then, as I look at the world around me, can I see what is life-giving and draw it out of others? There are many friends such as Glee, who in spite of being quite angry and protective of her son, are able to listen deeply. All of us are encouraged to seek guidance from that inward teacher as to what actions should be taken and to look past immediate issues. When we do this, when we dig deeper, we can open up underlying concerns and make space for others to respond in a way that brings true change. This is what the everyday prophet does, be it in their family, in the meeting community, or as a public figure witnessing to the world. Such action is grounded in worship, in attention to the force of love in our midst, and in the need for justice and equality that can undergird peace. Have you ever experienced a prodding from the light to engage with the woes of the world? If a key movement towards being an everyday prophet is about listening within for the voice of the light, what might that feel like? So let me share with you a vivid story from our Quaker past. In 1750, Samuel Bonus reported how, as a young man, perhaps about age 20, he would dutifully attend worship every Sunday with his parents and his siblings. It seems not to have been a particularly edifying experience. As he describes it, I can imagine him napping a bit, or wondering about lunch, or planning to meet up with his friends, maybe keeping an eye on an attractive young woman across the room, whatever was in his life at the time. He described himself as devoted to pleasure. One first day, as he sat in the meeting house, a visiting friend stood and began to speak. As Ann Wilson preached, she looked straight at him, pointing her finger. A traditional Quaker, thou comest to meeting as thou went from it the last time, and goest from it as thou came to it, but art no better for thy coming. What wilt thou do in the end? These words of Ann Wilson shattered Samuel's comfort and led him into a lifelong ministry. And they feel alive for me today and keep making me ask myself, how did being in worship change me? Have I reached deep? Am I living in even a tiny way more consistent with being part of that new creation? Ann Wilson's words, which might seem alien to some of us, are rooted in early Quaker knowledge of the working of the inward light. Today we often reference holding someone in the light as a way of praying for their comfort and well-being. Yet, I recall being taken strongly aback one day when I came to experience the light not as a benign, gentle warmth, but rather as a spotlight, searching my soul, tore into the corners of my interior, making things visible that I had tried to ignore. I could no longer pretend they did not exist. The low light showed me when I had acted contrary to its guidance, but it also, more surprisingly, it made visible at the same time how thoroughly I was loved, how thoroughly each of us is loved. And it made clear to me that I was worthy to speak. I could fight it off, but ultimately, I could not escape the message of the light to stop believing the voices from my childhood that said I had nothing to say, and to listen instead to the Spirit. The light shows us how to enjoy and value our being, how to engage anew with the world. This is part of the power of the eternal, the light which ultimately leads into healing, growth, and wholeness. The work of the light is not the property of a special chosen few, but present for all who accept it and move with it and live into the changes it makes possible. It was simply noticing a glimmer of light, a divine nudge inside, that made John Woolman, a young shopkeeper, hesitate in writing the bill of sale for a slave. Out of eventual obedience to this light, in this apparently ordinary action, grew a lifelong practice that led to the end of slaveholding by old Quakers. As he wrote in his journal, that my employer, having a Negro woman, sold her and desired me to write a bill of sale. So through weakness, I wrote it. But at the executing of it, I was so afflicted in my mind that I said to my master and to the friend that I believe slave keeping to be inconsistent with the Christian religion. John Woolman's experience with the slave was set in the midst of years of seeking to hear God's voice and obey it. As this example shows, it was often an erratic journey, but one that led him to reach out to others around him, both the fellow Quaker who was buying the slave and his employer, and call them to see that as Christians, they should free themselves of slave holding. The path to recognizing and naming a ministry is not always simple or obvious, even though being a Quaker is about being open to the fact that each of us has a ministry to live, some kind of service in the world. A few people experience a moment when life changes. It may be a major shift, perhaps triggered by the death of a loved one or an illness. It might be a divine calling to work perhaps to end the spread of nuclear arms, or a decision to stop using alcohol. It may be one of a whole series of very small steps, such as one day I woke from a dream aware I had to get up drinking 4 cups of coffee a day. Changed things. Those of us who've experienced those sharp, unmistakable moments of turning find that translating that into daily life takes patience and commitment. It's greatly aided by those who walk alongside us. Living in this world is a demanding task. It can take all our energy and attention just to get through the day, much less pay attention to the Spirit. The press of the here and now is real and demanding. We may hardly recognize when our lives have slipped into constant activity that has little to do with the values we hold most dear. Yet even in the rush of obligations, the deepest hope of our hearts might glimmer through. Dorsey Green, from a friend in Seattle, calls attention to the times we may be doing God's work without any awareness of calling or even conscious decision-making. She says, I actually suspect that many people are called to prophetic action and act on that call without recognizing it for what it is. I think most of us need to pay a lot of attention and listen for divine direction. The world is so busy and fast that I can certainly go a long time before I realize I'm not listening or grounded. Like Dorsey, I know I need practice. Practice to notice that the wind is beginning to fill the sails. I need external reminders to still my mind, to let go of the internal commentary, to not pronounce judgment on everything around, especially my own behavior. In the constant chatter, there can be little room for the inward guide to get in a word edgewise. Some people carry a sense of holy direction all their lives. Yet as someone who spent over half my life with no inkling I might possibly have a ministry, or even open to hearing the Spirit present in my life, I am all too aware how unexpected the divine calling is for some of us. So while this call may be gentle and simple, only requiring us to act for a moment or in small private ways, to listen for and respond to such nudges is at the core of being an everyday prophet. At the times, the call may be broader, to more visible work, to the work of a radical prophet, to the being a public friend. Such friends only flourish amid supportive communities that carry the vision of prophetic ministry and living into the new creation. So being a prophet, an everyday prophet, is about serving with humility and with boldness. No matter how one names the inward guide, for this to be a true guide, we must be called, as Micah tells us, to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. At the same time, we know that some prophets are given words to say or actions to take, and pressed by the Spirit to be bold, even in the face of hostility and doubt. In the face of the infinite, the only sane posture is that of humility. Sailing in the waters of the Pacific Northwest, in the North American coast, has given me a visceral sense of the immensity of the world and of divine grace. Through much of this evening, I offer you glimpses of my experiences in these majestic, demanding waters as a way to speak about that which is in many ways unseen and beyond our knowing. The inward teacher can show us how we might live more humbly, knowing that we're no better and no worse than others around us. We have no special right to wealth or privilege, no special claim to think that everything we have to say, even in worship, has merit. At the same time, when we have engaged in discernment, perhaps with the gift of a clearness committee to help us know the motion of the Spirit in our lives, we have the responsibility to speak boldly. So what does it mean to me to be humble? I think about this as being grounded and without pretense. Being fertile soil for the growth of the Spirit, as Thomas says for our gardens. That knowing that I'm no better, no more worthy than others, knowing that I'm no less worthy either. Can we come to live with an undivided heart and be teachable? Be open to the unexpected. And walk with God to stand in that place of love and listen and follow that inward guide. The day that I wrote this, John Muhanji, who serves at Friends United meeting as a mission director in Kenya, posted the following on Facebook. He said, "Why is humility a strong Quaker value? Humility is the true key to success. Successful people lose their way at times, as some Quakers did in the past. They often embrace and overindulge from the fruits of success. Humility halts this arrogance and self-indulging trap. Humble people share the credit and wealth, remain focused and hungry to continue the journey." Muhanji names his work as promoting the ministry of Christ. Most of us in this room, I suspect, likely identify this work in terms of such things as replacing retributive punishment with restorative justice, of finding ways to create a society grounded in nonviolence, of valuing the whole planet we live on. Yet without humility, we're all susceptible to being pulled into the materialistic values of the culture around us. Then there's the part about serving boldly. To sail amid the rocks, the strong currents and tides of the British Columbia coast takes a boldness that is grounded in practice, in the deep knowledge of the boat, the waters, and the ways of the wind. It requires constant awareness of the shifting conditions. This is the link between humility and boldness. So if we're to be humble, how might we also serve boldly? So often being bold gets tangled up with aggression and anger. Such attacks often contribute to adversarial situations and cut off the possibility of problem solving and developing relationships. Following are some of the ways that being a Quaker has taught me about living boldly. Standing still in the light. Start in prayer, if you will. Do truth. Live in that power of life that takes away the occasion for war. Be passionate. Act out of the courage that comes with faithfulness from the Spirit. Act with clarity and see beneath the words. Seek a just peace. Empower others and don't just assume what they want and need. Listen with respect for the divine spark in each heart. Speak truthfully. Be transparent. Be willing to have your words and actions tested. Know when anger energizes you and when it is pressing towards destruction. Be kind. Live in a state of teachable assurance. Always be grounded in compassion and come to know the deep joy that's there. And constantly seek guidance. Over the years, speaking up, being bold, these have been the hardest actions for me. I do not talk easily. I dislike things that call attention to myself. Thus, to speak boldly is a critical spiritual discipline for me. How can I notice when I should be doing this? I too often notice well after the fact and am embarrassed. Can I find ways to make amends for when I am wrongly silent? Such are the dimensions of this spiritual discipline in my life. I know in the States, liberal friends often joke about being introverts, so I'm clearly not alone in needing to practice being bolder. For others, however, the challenge may be along the lines of recognizing when speaking firmly slides over into hostility to others and becomes destructive. This is all part of staying in touch with that spirit, which can keep our lives in balance so we might better build up our communities and find ways to strengthen others rather than berating them. Being a friend often calls us into living amid paradoxes. Not only are we asked to walk humbly and serve boldly, but also to take personal responsibility, even as we are sustained by grace. One challenge for us today as friends is to define a clear group identity for ourselves, and at the same time be radically inclusive. Many more such paradoxes exist. When we as human beings set up such issues in opposition to one another, they polarize us and cause us to reject one another or even demonize one another. Grace abounds when we can recognize the paradox as such, rather than assuming the worst or projecting our fears onto those of different beliefs. Headwinds. Anyone who has taken the helm of a sailboat for any length of time knows viscerally the wind blowing right in your face that pushes you to a stop, or even backwards if you attempt to steer directly into its force. Tacking, the art of using the energy of that headwind, but at an angle, so it still propels you ahead, is integral to any sailor's skill set. Done well, it can move the boat swiftly and smoothly in the direction you're headed. Your course will not be a neat, straight line, but rather seem to take you to one side or to the other. Learning when to come about and head in on another bearing is essential to keeping off the rocks. Following the inward guide opens the way we are to go, but does not necessarily mean our path will be free of obstacles. When strong headwinds arise, humanity too often seeks to overpower them, making bigger and better engines to fight the wind. The nature of ministry is to take a different way, to work with the headwinds as experienced sailors do, while knowing that divine power that is protecting and guiding us at all times. The headwinds may rise out of personal fears or reflect a community that seeks the comfort of the world as its primary aim and rejects divisive action. There are lots of internal invisible headwinds. I could talk for hours about them. There's seemingly infinite ways we can hurt one another or resist taking on the risks of being changed ourselves, even when we see the rightness of a new way of engaging with the world. The prophet, be it the everyday prophet, the radical prophet, or the prophetic community, has no assurance of success beyond faithfulness and faith that their witness is an essential counter to the violence of society. Our spiritual ancestors knew a lot about internal resistance and the need to keep seeking the light even when it seems gone. Isaac Pennington tells us, when the life is at any time lost, the only way of recovering is by retiring to the invisible and keeping there and growing up there. This is another reminder for me to learn the feel of the wind in the sails, rather than to give in to discouragement or anger. There are many loud and visible winds out there, and opposition can arise in any community, and disagreement. Even though we, in many ways, may be a community that has common views. The timing and issues where we disagree was distinctive to each situation. But the reaction to anyone who names flaws or makes visible hurts that have been long ignored sometimes can be quite deadening. Fighting such winds is exhausting. If the sails are set wrong, the boat can be tossed around or overturned. Surprisingly, even a seemingly fair wind from astern that moves the boat quickly on the course that it's been set can suddenly become threatening if the wind shifts. So let me give you a couple examples of external headwinds in our lives. Pressures from our various communities, the neighborhood, our families, the workplace, that can readily push on any of us and make us hesitate to act. These headwinds may be awareness that others will not approve, the potential that we may lose a good job, or the possibility of alienation from family or friends. Arthur Roberts, an evangelical friend who lives near me, tells this story from his youth during the civil rights era, when an African-American family moved into his neighborhood that stirred up strong emotions and an angry community meeting. Arthur asked himself about this meeting, should I attend? Should I be silent? Should I speak? I pondered how block-busting strategies by realtors would probably lead to the diminishment and even demise of our meeting. Silence seemed prudent. Then he asked himself, or should I speak up for racial integration? Nudged by the Spirit, I chose to do so. So in the meeting, I nervously stood up. Arthur defended his new neighbors and was booed by his community. Old neighbors, longtime neighbors, demanded of his meeting that he be fired as the pastor. He did get to keep his job as Quaker pastor, but within a few years, the Friends meeting closed as the neighborhood changed. He doesn't know still if he changed anything, but in retrospect, he noted that sometimes it is difficult to take principled action in the face of probable and unwanted pragmatic consequences. But perhaps my faithfulness to truth led to personal choices by others who affirm Christian principles that in the long run led to a greater positive good. So sometimes we may seem to fail, and sometimes we never know the consequences of our actions. Another example is from my meeting, which long had considered itself open and welcoming to the gays and lesbians among us. Many contradictory and shifting winds arose in the face of Bonnie Tinker's efforts in the 1980s to convince us that prejudice against gays and lesbians was actually alive and painfully visible among us. Bonnie was a member of our meeting and a nationally known activist for gay and lesbian rights. She had a message for us. She asked in many ways for us to change and to help change the wider society. At times, we recognized her message and supported her. At times, we felt pushed too hard and fought back. We could not change at the speed she wanted us to. The engagement was erratic and prolonged. The conflicted feelings resulted in the meeting minuting our report of our ministry, but not helping her financially. Her insistence that we should marry all couples on the same basis without regard to sex caused us to stop marrying anyone for several years. I believe there's still those who have not forgiven us this. The conflicting feelings led to business meetings where many people spoke out of bitterness and agony. The process was neither clear nor simple. And we were by no means the only meeting to resist the request of gays and lesbians among us to be treated as full equals in their full selves. So this radical prophet was not always welcome among us, even as more and more of us came to agree her message was rightly given. It also raised the dilemma that changing hearts can take time and hard work, even when injustice calls for immediate action. The beauty and weakness of seeking unity rather than a quick vote with a majority winning is partly in this dilemma. Those who disagree can't be ignored and told to shape up. The desire is that all be brought into at least a recognition that the Spirit is at work, even if they cannot fully agree with the outcome. This is part of the preparation of the prophet. Recognition of the likelihood they may not be well received, certainly not among those whose fears they are exposing, perhaps not even in their home community. When we come to that recognition, can we also learn to ask, where do I find support when these headwinds arise? And what are my own weaknesses that, if not addressed, will cause me to steer off course and to fail in my own faithfulness? One friend, Becky Ankeny, tells of the need for dynamic listening rather than a rigid set of rules. Even in apparently small things, the light may call us into actions which terrify us or ask us to take risks. Fear blocks me, yet sometimes it is a guide for me. Surprisingly, there's a certain quality of fear that indicates yes. You are to do this, you are to say this. When I can follow that leading, I gain a deep sense of peace. Prophetic ministry, even of the everyday sort, asks us to pay attention each day for listening for that holy voice and to act with courage in response. Part of being a gathered body means naming the community we want to be. Edward Hicks's paintings, and he did many of them, of the peaceable kingdom, use imagery from Isaiah. Isaiah envisioned a world where the lion lies down with the lamb. The child is safe next to the adder. This painting names his hope for the kingdom of God on earth and has long shaped my vision of this new creation. Yet it seems at odds with what we know of the natural environment, and I'm not sure it's at all that it's the image for today. For instance, we know now how important key predators are to the balance of nature. According to the conservationist Joe Scott, cooperation and conflict drive plant and animal adaptation. Species in their habitats thrive as interactive dynamic systems that are constantly testing and reshaping each other. Without the presence of carnivores, snowshoe hares, for instance, overwhelm the capacity of the land to support them. Where do we find balance on this earth? I don't have a good way yet to blend this into my hopes for what the world might be. Yet I hope we can engage together in creating a vision, a theology of earth care witness to help us reshape how we interact with the whole of this earth. I know many people today have been engaged in efforts to envision how humans might best live on this planet in harmony with God's way and with the natural world that sustains us. I'm certain we can't move uncritically from examples taken from the wild as we seek images of the world as we want it to be. Yet many compelling examples exist and can be valuable. I know Susanna K. Brindle in her Backhouse lecture 16 years ago offered a vivid sense of her engagement with the Aboriginal peoples that can contribute to a real reconciliation with the earth and all the varied parts of humanity that inhabit this planet. I only hope that more of us can be engaged in this visioning work. I do know that being embedded in a community teaches us much about how to relate to the other human beings and to how to see our place on this globe, as well as that we all call home. In community, we learn ways of responding to disagreements, making decisions when we hold different understandings about issues that affect us deeply. We learn to stand with people when they are overwhelmed with emotions. The vision our community holds about the future, whether we call it the new creation, the kingdom of God, or something else, shapes us and is integral to our witness in the world. This vision points to ways we might come closer to being a community of everyday prophets. Having seen the beauty of such a vision, friends over the generations have held it up as a reality that can be manifest on earth. In knowing this vision, it becomes easier to see when the world is out of balance. To name that imbalance and to take steps to restore it is also the work of the prophet. Radical prophets may do this in quite public arenas. But I think even more essential is an array of everyday prophets who live out the vision in our schools, in our homes, in our meetings. Without the body of faithful who listen to the light and help others do the same, radical prophets can be alone and lost. If you align your boat, your heart, if you will, at the correct angle to the headwind and set your sails accordingly, it is possible to sail quickly and freely. Because you are moving at an angle to where you want to be, readjusting course and resetting the sails is essential if the overall movement is to be in the right direction. In tight places, when the wind is strong and rocks nearby, the boat may need to come about quite frequently to adjust to these forces we humans do not control. Thus, it can be as we engage one another, not by clashing, but feeling where the wind is shifting and engaging with it, knowing that interplay which brings us all home. My journey heads towards the spiritual North Star. At least that's my intent. This small boat that I call my body has few defenses against the power of the waves. The power of my muscles and my will are readily overwhelmed by the force of an active storm, or even the intensity of day-to-day winds. Much of the time, I do not have the option of powering straight ahead to follow that star, unless the wind is with me and the currents aren't too strong. This image I can feel in my bones from sailing in the Gulf Islands in Desolation Sound, off the coast of Alaska in the open ocean. In such territory, there are many narrow places where the winds and the current are against you, more than the capacity of the boat to overcome. The only option is to wait for the winds to change or the tide to turn. Other days it's still and beautiful, but no air is moving to fill the sails. Thus, you can only remain at dock or drift on the currents. When facing a strong headwind, there's no use cursing it and trying to go directly to your destination. You'll only be blown backwards, perhaps on the rocks. This is most evident in the small boats I know, but even in the largest of our human freighters can find itself caught on a reef or stuck aground in the mud. I find this such a helpful metaphor for the way humans often want to engage with those with whom they disagree. We have such an impulse to attack, to contradict, to let others know we have the right answer. We try to bully our way into the headwind and find the pushback harsh, can make no headway. Then there was the day we were sailing when the wind was blowing strong. 6 of us were on a sailboat headed towards the rocks off the coast at an exhilarating speed. We were confident in our ability to steer this boat and have it come about, to turn away from the shore and begin the next leg of the journey. As we approached the rocks, about to make this move that would take us back out to sea, there was a loud ripping sound. The jenny, the large sail on the front of our boat, tore raggedly in two. This turn was not going to happen as we planned. Our skipper headed the boat directly into the wind and dropped our remaining sails, so the wind was no longer pressing us as hard towards the rocks. The most agile among us clambered over the rigging and took down the shreds of the old sail and rigged a new one. We can train and practice and hone our skills. We can memorize our most central texts, be they the Bible or the sailing manual. But there is the moment when the sail rips to shreds. The moment when everything we thought would happen, when all our apparent control fails. The moment that when all we can do is to point the boat directly into the wind, the point where the motion stops. In that moment of stillness, we can begin removing the tatters of expectations and put up the new sail that could once again catch the winds. When we have attended to the Spirit over the years and learned something of the nature of that divine breath, we can settle back into the stillness, listening for the inward guide. Out of that stillness, we can find the way forward. If we panic and flail and get caught up in our own emotions, we may easily be stuck in crisis. The more we know the ship, ourselves, our community, and are familiar with the nature of that holy wind, the more we are able to right ourselves and find the course that is ours to follow. Anger on the open sea is a danger to all, losing track of where the wind is, ignoring the gathering, billowing clouds. Such inattention can easily result in swamping the boat or someone being washed overboard. This reality amplifies the need to take fruitful action. Attention to God demands that we attend to the health and safety of people and the world around us. This is true in multiple dimensions. Jesus, for instance, was concerned to heal the body and the soul, the heart and the mind. Jesus also knew that those he healed would not always be grateful. The Gospel of John shares the story of one man whom Jesus healed, yet the man still turned him into the authorities. What is important is that this did not stop Jesus from doing the healing. Awareness of the winds of the Spirit tells us much about how we might act in response to our own fury at injustice and evil. How might we do so without laying out more harm? Can we set the sails with skill and press hard to challenge injustice? Both these actions ask us to find the balance between the energy that propels us to action and the decided inward calm that lets us read the waves and calculate our course from the stars. There is a vast openness in which we sail. To be out under the night sky in a small boat, this is how I best know how to describe the infinite. The water in the sky, that is all there is. Depending on the night, the sky may carry its own brilliance of stars beyond naming. The sea may display a phosphorescent wave trailing in our path. The moon may light up mountains along the barely visible coastline. Or the absent moon and stars may leave a different emptiness. The times when the clouds touch the water make the world infinitely finite, without boundaries or borders. This is how it is to be totally centered and grounded in God. To be bound in the unceasing distance of all that gives life and awareness. This is where the prophetic ministry begins and returns again and again for substance and renewal. And this image is also part of the vision carried by friends, that of visibility and openness. The city of God is a city on the hill that cannot be hid, the lighted candle that won't be confined underneath a basket. The story of the children of Reading is often told, but I never tire of it. When friends met for worship in the early days of our Quaker history, the soldiers came and dragged adults to prison. When other similar groups experienced the same imprisonment, they hid and they met in secret. Friends continued to announce the time and place of meeting. Then, when all the adults were imprisoned, the children continued to gather and worship at the appointed time and place. This example seems right for our time and speaks to something that occasionally it seems to be slipping from friends, the willingness to be visible and not to hide. To speak of the power of the holy in the world and in individual lives. It's a witness that challenges any government that wants to control its populace and intimidate in the name of safety. Our meetings serve an important purpose as refuges from the violence of the culture around us. We can be places of protection and healing. Both of these functions are badly needed. But we carry the heritage of willingness to rely on the strength and power of the infinite to carry us back into society and witness to another way of being that is grounded in beauty, not in fear. Then there is the release. Specific callings to ministry, to prophetic work for social justice, do not necessarily last forever or even for a person's lifetime. We reach the safe harbor, the end of the voyage, or the transition to a new leg of the trip, Attentiveness is needed to know when to lay down such work. The particular work as a whole may be done, or it may be that a given task is complete. The gift may be withdrawn for some other reason. A clear vision may come, signaling release, as it did for John Woolman, who wrote of being released from a task. He says that my exercise was heavy, and I was deeply bowed in spirit before the Lord. At length, feeling my mind released from the burden which I had been under, I took my leave of them in a good degree of satisfaction. In this case, Woolman was referring to the burden he felt to speak with some weighty friends who were slaveholders. Woolman spoke to them all about the concern he carried and how he brought them together. After this, he felt released from his work. His only task was to raise this concern and leave it in the hands of others to listen to their own hearts. The release from ministry or from a particular task may be distinct and clear. It may be a niggling sense of completion or awareness that someone else has taken up the task, or that health or other demands of life made it impossible to continue. At times, a clearness process for laying down a ministry may be as valuable to the individual and the community as are the clearness committees that aid consideration of taking up the call. It should be honored similarly. Arrival in port releases us from the demands of skippering and crewing the vessel that carries us, whether it be a sailboat or simply our own skin and bones. In the harbor, there's protection from the heavy winds and seas, opportunity to find fresh food and water, friends, old or new, to welcome us, dry clothes, and much more. Awareness of the need to enter the harbor to find renewal, or even complete the journey and sell the boat, may be among our tasks. So being a band of everyday prophets. Is this possible for friends? I believe so, but it is not an easy task to take up. I believe this is at the core of what we are all about, a faithfulness to the divine guide that breaks open hearts and remakes them with compassion. People who know the touch of the light and are willing to follow where it leads. These people can knit together our communities. At the same time, such people help make visible when we and the world around us falls short of what we might be. Such everyday prophets are at once ordinary and radical, both humble and bold. They act out a weave of mercy and justice, valuing each being on this earth. Might we cherish those among us who are so faithful.